And we're live. Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our presentation of Kathy Fiskus, A Tragedy That Transfixed the Nation. We are here today with author William Deverell and journalist Abcarian. This event includes an audience Q&A, and to submit your question, please use the Ask a Question button at the very bottom of the page. You can also vote for any questions you'd like for our guests to answer, and they will make their way to the very top of the list. Also, please consider supporting Vroman's Bookstore tonight by purchasing a copy of Kathy Fiskus. Just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer's screen. It will take you to our website where you can complete your purchase. Vroman's is the oldest independent bookstore in Southern California. We've been around since 1894, and it's thanks to generous patrons like yourselves who keep our lights on. So we'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and let me quickly introduce our guests and then we can jump right in. So William Deverell is a professor of history and director of the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West at the University of Southern California. He is the author of numerous studies of the 19th and 20th century American West, including Whitewashed Adobe, Shaped by the West, and Railroad Crossings. Joining him tonight is Abcarian, who is an opinion columnist specializing in politics and culture at LA Times. She has written frequently about the Me Too movement and women's rights and has covered the past 4 presidential campaigns. She has also served as an editor for the paper's feature section and has covered the Oscars, Emmys, and the Sundance Film Festival. So with that said, I'm going to turn things over to our guests and enjoy the talk, everyone.
Thank you, and welcome everybody tonight. Hi, Bill. It's so nice to see you. So I want to start by asking, before we delve into this really tragic story that has so many threads of culture running through it, what is your fascination with the West? What makes this part of the world so fascinating to you?
Great question. I'm grateful to you, Robin, for being here this evening, and thanks to Vroman's, our beloved independent bookstore, for inviting the two of us, and thanks to everybody for being here. Well, I grew up in the West, by and large. We had some time abroad when my father was in the United States Air Force, but I grew up in Colorado, went to college here in California, and as a kid, I'd been in Northern California, and my parents, to their great credit, made sure that my sister and I got out and about across the American West. So we were a big camping family, a big history family, and I think it just took. I also remember being fascinated by the mysteries of the American West. Where did that ghost town go? Where did those people go? What happened when the gold ran out? I remember.
Where is the treasure in the White Sands missile range?
Oh, there too, yeah. And I remember as a kid being utterly convinced in the Rocky Mountains that there was a tribe of indigenous Colorado natives who had yet to be discovered. I don't think that's true, but I still like to hold on to it.
Great, I love it. There's another book for you to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Kathy Fiskus, A Tragedy That Transfixed a Nation. Tell us exactly who Kathy Fiskus was, and if you would, set the stage for us a little bit historically and culturally speaking, since the events of this book take place in 1949 in San Marino. Tell us a little bit about Kathy and her family and what was happening in California at that time.
Sure. So let me just close this. Sorry, everybody. I'm just going to close this a little bit so I don't have that bright light in my face.
We think you look good by sunlight.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, there. That should be a little bit better. This is the immediate post-war period, a period where California, as other parts of the nation, but California is the focus of a great deal of rejuvenative, regenerated, reimaginative energy about now we've gone through the Depression and the war. So there's a great deal of hopefulness, which is marked in part by the arrival of the baby boom. Yes. This little girl is a baby boomer. She's born in 1946. And Southern California is very busy with suburban expansion, collegiate and educational expansion during the early years of the Cold War through the GI Bill. So I don't want to paint too glorious a vision of the past, but it is marked by a great deal of hopefulness about the future. And that's the crucible of this event.
Right. And so what was San Marino like in 1949? We think of it now as, well, some of us think of it as the place where USC's president lives. Some of us think of it as the home of I'm going to get this wrong. I know it's the Huntington is right off of San Marino, but
It's in San Marino. Yep, sure enough.
And it's always described as being in Pasadena, I think.
Yep, right, right.
But anyway, we think of it as a very high-end, affluent, suburban community. But
Yes.
I don't think that's really what it was like at the time Kathy Fiskus was alive, right?
Certainly not to the degree that it's known and understood to be today. Certainly not. So, well-to-do, yes. But also, I think if we could transport ourselves back through time machine technology, we'd be surprised about how much open space is still on the landscape of the San Gabriel Valley, how much citrus was still hanging on. And so it's not rural, at least not that part of it, but it's small town America, a bit more well-to-do than most small town Americas, and then in the intervening 70 years, very well-to-do.
Exactly. And then tell us a little bit about the Fiskus family, where they were living and what their yard was like.
So David Fiskus is the superintendent for a oddly named company that shows us about the mergers of that era, the California Water and Telephone Company. He had come from a water management family down in San Diego County, and apparently very good at his job, understanding wells and water and the distribution thereof. And the family lived in a fairly small and nondescript clapboard house at the edge of a field in San Marino, a 6-acre field that was weedy and covered with as many as, in a couple hundred yards distance, as many as a dozen active and inactive wells.
These are water wells.
These are water wells that date back. The indigenous people had understood how much water was either surface water in the San Gabriel Valley, or particularly how much water is below the San Gabriel Valley, which is prodigious by way of a series of aquifers. And so from indigenous times of pre-contact forward into the mission period and into the American agricultural period, utilizing that water had become tried and true practice for agricultural purposes in and around the San Gabriel Valley. So these are water wells with the water table, at least in the early days, so late 19th and early 20th century, the water table just 7 to 10 feet down below the earth.
Would rise and fall. So these were not the engineered wells that were part of California's great water projects that would come later. These were,
yeah, that's right. These are, for want of a better term, kind of mom and pop wells.
Okay.
These are wells that individuals would bore into the earth to water their citrus or other agricultural products, or these are water company wells, increasingly small water companies that would gather up the results of multiple wells and then through reservoirs and cisterns and whatnot, distribute that to customers.
So tell us what happened on the day that Kathy, who was 3 years old, disappeared in 1949, leading to some extraordinary changes in the way the world communicates, covers live news events. She captivated, I think, not just the country, but the world. So tell us exactly how that began.
So I do think of this event as revolutionary in its impact. It's a very microcosmic event. It's a single episode across a long weekend in April of 1949. It's about Easter time. At that field where the Fiskus home was, Mrs. Fiskus, Alice, and her sister Jeanette, who'd come up with her family that day on April 8th, Friday afternoon, the relatives had come up from San Diego County to spend the weekend. Kathy and her older sister Barbara, who was 9 at the time, were playing with their 2 male cousins, Stanley and Gus, and the family dog Jeepers, or Jeep, they called him. And they're just playing in the field, as any kid would love to do.
Yeah.
So the sisters are in the kitchen chatting and catching up as the sun began to drop towards sunset. And Alice Fiskus looked out the window and noticed that one of the children was missing, and it was the littlest one. And so that launches this event.
And this was the story where kids just played freely. There was not the kind of...
Yes, I think I agree with you. I think that
paranoia, security gates that we've all grown up with our kids.
Yes, these children had the run of the field. There's a new elementary school at the time, which is now taken up by San Marino High School. But they had the run of that school and its playground facilities. So sure, I think the children had quite a bit of freedom to play, and I'm sure they were terribly excited to have their cousins there. And so the children were out playing, and then what had been 4 children and a dog very quickly looked to be 3 children and a dog.
And the mom noticed it immediately?
Yes, although I think given some interviews that she did years later, I think she did what parents would do, which is, now where has she gone?
Yeah.
Not fear, concern, and terror, but that's to come when it becomes clear that she's fallen down a well.
How did that become clear? What was the process? How did they find out?
When Alice Fiskus and her sister come out into the weedy field in search of Kathy, she's nowhere to be found, and they begin a hunt that grows fairly feverish fairly quickly, as I understand it. Alice got into the family car and she drove to the nearby elementary school, just hundreds of yards away, but she wanted to get there quickly. And Kathy's not there. And she returns and they go out back into the field where the children had been still there. And the littlest cousin, Gus, who's aged 5, calls out from near a tractor device, which was in that field, and says, she's here, she's over here. And at that point, the adults come over and it's the open face of a well casing that she's fallen into.
How would there be an open well casing in a field that children play with, which shows my late 20th century mom sensibility, but still, I mean, was the peril not recognized at the time, or?
So I think there's several ways to answer this, none of which are definitive, unfortunately. One is the well casing that she falls into is extraordinarily narrow. So it's 14 inches across. It's
okay,
tiny.
14 inches across.
I think, basically think of a steering wheel,
Right.
the circumference of a steering wheel.
I would not fit in that.
Nor would I.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the lack of, overweening concern. But also the well had been capped. At some point, when it is abandoned, it's bored in 1903. And at some point, 20, 25 more years later, it has some kind of cap put on it, which was probably either a piece of wood somehow affixed or a piece of metal welded atop, but the cap was no longer there. And I don't think this is terribly unusual because children in the neighborhood talked about the discovery of old wells. It's peppered with wells. Talked about the discovery of old wells that were no longer active, that they liked to throw stones down. So I think there's a lot of them.
Yeah. How deep was that well?
When it's initially bored in the first years of the 20th century, it's 500 feet deep.
Oh my God. Okay. So what happens? How do they discover that she's in the well? The little boy says, she's here, she's here. How did they confirm that? Was she near the top? She's
not really near the top. She is actually, this is part of the discovery of what's going on. She's fallen a great deal of distance down that well, nowhere near its depth, but she's fallen a very long ways. And it gradually becomes clear to the adults and first responders just how far she's fallen. So the way they discover her is she's crying. She's crying and she's terrified. And her mother calls out to her and she answers her mother. But at first, for probably reasons of just willful hope, they think that she's fallen only so far that they can get her out. So
reach in.
Exactly, reach in, or draw. A neighbor brings by a long spool of telephone cord in hopes that maybe she could grab it or maybe she could somehow get it on herself, and they pull her up. So they don't know that she's fallen as far as she has. And in fact, she may not have fallen as far initially, but eventually she falls 90 feet.
Slip. So what we think of today, there's whitewater rescue teams and there's helicopter teams for people who fall, get trapped in the mountains. What is there at this point in terms of public safety infrastructure and staff for an event like this, which I have to think has happened before, given the proliferation of wells?
Yes, it had happened before, and children are in harm's way from time immemorial, and with some frequency, they're in harm's way below the surface of the earth. So there are first responders, there are rescue vehicles. The Pasadena Fire Department, not Little San Marino, which is a small operation, Pasadena Fire Department has a large, brand new emergency rescue vehicle with all kinds of gizmos and gadgets. Not necessarily how do you get a child out of a deep well, but they come there in hopes that they can figure it out. And they're joined by engineers and others who figure that the way to get her out is probably to go down for her.
So how do the engineers converge on the scene? How do they even know? I mean, how did word spread about this kid in the well?
Fairly early on, there's wire service reportage there. And so the word goes out that a little girl, initially the call to the San Marino Police Department is, little girl has fallen in a hole. Fairly quickly, it's determined that that's a well, and it probably goes a long ways into the earth. So the word then whips around by radio and print journalism first, that a child's fate is unknown, she's alive, she's fallen down a well, there's a rescue attempt. So police department, fire department, sheriffs, Pasadena police, Pasadena fire, and then calls are made by mostly city engineers who work for the city of San Marino, get the contractors here, get the diggers here, the equipment and the men who know how to dig big, deep holes in the earth, and converging on the scene already by dark of the Friday that she falls in, increasing numbers of rescue vehicles and equipment to try to figure out how to go down there. And by and large, these are men who know what to do. They just don't know how to do it. They don't know, how do we get her?
So what were some of the various plans advanced that they thought might work? You talked about dropping a rope down.
Yeah, so this is part of the strange fascination that I and others have for this event. It's just how unusual it is in terms of, well, how are we going to save this little girl and get her out of there? One option, of course, is to go down the way she did. So how do we get down that well casing and reach her? Which would entail someone, of course, being dropped head first down a dark and tightly constricted and likely rusty and dangerous well casing. That actually is an option. A call goes out to Santa Anita for jockeys. There's some consideration that the thin man from the circus, there's a traveling circus, maybe the thin man could get his 14-inch circumference body lowered down there. Other people from both the region and beyond begin to tell.
An elevator operator suit, whose picture I saw. Who was that?
Yes, so actually we can show that. Shall we show that? Do you want to show some images?
Maybe we should show a picture of Kathy too.
Yeah, so Rira, we might want to just speed through a couple of these images that help us set the scene the way we just did as well in talking.
And I'm amazed by how you're building up to this sense of really a circus, in both literally and metaphorically. There were circus performers who came out.
Yes.
People, as you say in your book, began gathering. People from the area began hearing, and reporters began showing up.
Yes.
And
yes. I'm sorry to interrupt, Robin, but yes, it is a circus-like atmosphere across the long 48 hours of the rescue attempt. But I say that not to detract at all from the heroism of the people who tried to save this little girl. And so it is a very strange event, but it's marked by sacrifice and heroism. So here she is near her home, a little bit younger than when she went into the well, when she was 3. And then if we can see the next one, this is one of my most, I think, one of the more remarkable photographs, because this is early in the rescue attempt. This is just before dark, I'm assuming, on Friday. She goes in around 4:30. So you see it's a fairly modest attempt by a fire rescue vehicle and some men and women too go to the scene, of course, and children. But initially they think she's fallen into the nearby wash. And this is her aunt, Jeanette, lying down, and you see the policeman in the very center of the photograph cupping his hands to yell down to her.
So that's the actual well in the center of that photo?
Yes, a little hard to distinguish, but that's it. And you see they've got an electric light that they'd like to lower down there and see if they can light it up. They eventually drop down a camera and try to take photographs. That doesn't work. They drop down a microphone. That doesn't work too well either. And what they also do is they drop a a rubber ball on a piece of tape measure, and to measure both how far she is, so when the ball stops, but also to determine if she's wet or if she's underwater. And the ball comes up dry, but it does reveal that she's fallen 90 feet, so 9 stories.
So it did touch her. The ball touched her.
We assume it did. Yeah, I think it did, because she takes up the space inside that well down below.
9 stories. Wow.
Yeah, and you can see the concerns on the man there in the upper left. You see the concern on their face. This is well into the rescue attempt, which proceeds for, as I say, more than 48 hours nonstop. And as we were talking, Robin, the one way to go get her is to lower someone down her casing, or people suggest no. A doctor writes in a telegram to the San Marino Police Department and says, no, create a vacuum in her well casing and she'll be miraculously sucked to the top by a vacuum.
That doesn't sound prudent.
I don't think that was a good idea. It reveals the urgency of the moment.
Right.
But other people say you should get her by pouring water down her well and she'll slowly float to the top.
No.
That's a bad idea. Someone else says, no, you should put sand down the well and gradually she'll rise on the sand. So very quickly, her father says at the site, no one is going down that well. I won't permit it.
Did anybody, I feel like I saw a photograph of somebody being turned upside down or somebody struggling when they were, was it the physician that they were going to try to
Oh, yes, that's the physician. So we'll get, that's the physician who's lowered down later. But we can show, actually, Rira, can you just advance to the man in the bellhop suit, and then we'll go back to these others. One more. There we go. So just that number 9, Rira, would be great. This is the man you mentioned. This is a man named Johnny Roventini, who was a very well-known pitchman for Philip Morris cigarettes in the era. And he wore a bellhop uniform in his work as a pitchman, very successfully and famously for the cigarette company. And he was brought to the scene in his bellhop outfit as a potential rescuer who, given his diminutive size, could theoretically be lowered down her well casing to get her. But again, her father steps in, and it frankly doesn't look as though he's quite interested in trying to get her.
Yeah, I was going to say, how did Johnny feel about that? And how, I mean, you talk about lowering people headfirst into a 14-inch wide well. There were actually people who were willing to do that?
Not only that, but at least in a couple of cases, parents show up with their skinny children and volunteer them. Because people know through the rumor mill and also the crowds that congregate that she had been alive. And so the desperation is palpable.
Yeah. So talk about the growing crowd outside and the reporters who began showing up and how they were able to broadcast the story, which was a remarkable feat at the time.
Yes. By the evening of Friday, April 8th, 6, 7, 8, 9 hours after she'd fallen in, the scene gets lit up with brought in heavy duty lights, some of which are loaned by 20th Century Fox, Klieg lights.
Wow.
So night becomes day, and the notion of getting her out by going down the way she went in is set aside in favor of digging a parallel shaft that will go deep into the earth and then tunnel across. Men would tunnel across and open up her well casing and release her and pull her to safety up the rescue shaft. As this digging goes on, people from the neighborhood, and I've met many of them who remember this so clearly, were brought to the scene. What's going on? What's happening over by the Fiscus home? What's happening in the field? What's happening over by Carver Elementary? So the crowd swells. They're divided from the rescuers by a series of what eventually become chain link dividers. And they do what people would do. Some of them are just merely interested in the spectacle. Like, what's going on there? Many of them spend the night sleeping on the lawns of adjacent homes, or the teenagers climb the trees to look out on the rescue site. And they also do what people do in these moments across the world and through time. They hold hands and they sing and they pray and they cry, because people bond over the poignant story of a little girl or a little child deeply in trouble. And then as far as the news, as I say, print journalism from the LA Times actually gets there early. And then the wire services get a hold of it through those reporters or others. The still photographers come. It's a remarkably photographed event, as some of these images show.
Yeah.
But then within less than 24 hours after her fall, the television studios show up, television cameras, television reporters. Television is new. It's not brand new, but it's new. And television had not yet broken the barrier of remote live news broadcasts. There had been one event in 1947 where a metal plating plant blew up on Pico near downtown. And it caused great neighborhood destruction, and its destruction was filmed post facto and broadcast.
Mm-hmm.
But ongoing breaking news spectacles had not been broadcast, in large measure because they thought it was impossible. They thought that kind of remote transmission of live television footage was not yet possible. And they also thought that doing so would harm, if not, as they thought, actually melt their equipment. But one particular news producer or television producer thought, this is a human interest story. It's profoundly important. It's a spectacle. Let's try it. And so he sent his team to the site. Another station shows up not long afterwards, and they broadcast live breaking news television from the scene for 24 hours. And
now,
it completely changes. Sorry?
Go ahead. No, please, finish your thought.
Well, it just, as you say, it completely changes the ways in which television news, and in large measure media in general, are consumed and expected.
What I wanted to ask you is, how many people in the area even had television sets at that point?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not many, perhaps more than you might think, but the numbers I think are pretty reliable. Is about 20,000 television sets in greater LA at the time. So they're very expensive.
Yeah.
And the screen is small. Screen is 5 and 6 inches across, and oftentimes accompanied by I can't remember if it's either concave or convex, but a disc that you would hook onto the screen that they would amplify the picture to take up more space on the disc because the screen was so small. So not many. And televisions in the day are sold in appliance stores. Mm-hmm. So while the news broadcast is going on, this event is in part famous because the appliance stores put their TVs in the front window, if they hadn't been already, and keep them on. And people watch this standing in front of the windows of appliance stores in the wee hours across a long weekend.
Wow. And so was this being broadcast across the country?
No, the technology doesn't allow that. So it can only be broadcast in a fairly local way. These reporters and their technology are helped out immensely by the proximity of Mount Wilson, which is due north of this event. And they aim their cameras up there where they have transmission or transponder devices that help them to broadcast. So that's a lucky quirk of the geography of the event, but it works. And so the newsreels that then box up motion picture footage and send it around, that's how the world consumes it as a moving picture. But the local television is pretty local, or very local. But in the immediate aftermath of this event, into the early 1950s, television consumption purchase goes through the roof.
No kidding. So getting back to the rescue, what was going on in terms of digging the well? And were they digging a well that was much bigger and much wider to get down to so they could parallel across to her?
Yes, in fact, they tried two of them. So Rira, can we go up to number 8? So this, if I hadn't known what this was, I think I would have thought it's a picture of some kind of either major construction project or potentially a mine.
Yeah.
But this is a Kathy Fiskus photograph of the gathered rescuers and authorities and reporters. You can spot the reporters because they tend to be in the coat and tie, And this is rescue shaft number 1, which was, let's dig a big hole and we'll lower men down there and we'll tunnel across. Her well is within sight here somewhere, or maybe it's right to the my side of the photograph, our side of the photograph. The idea was, let's use big equipment, big clamshell diggers, big construction bosses, a kind of heavy-handed route to rescue. A number of men who are at the scene are known to comment while this is taking place. This is Saturday of the Friday, after the Friday, that this is a bad idea. That a big hole like that, A, takes too long, B, can fall in on itself, and C, all that heavy equipment on site may not be such a good thing for the fate of the little girl down below because of the jostling of the earth and kind of, earthquake reverberations of big, heavy equipment that was not often where that is. So, and in fact, these guys turn out to be right, because this hole is eventually abandoned. It does fall in on itself. They're dealing with very difficult soils, clayey, wet, alluvial from the San Gabriel Mountains over millennia. It's a difficult digging operation to hold tight unless you've got time to shore it up.
Mm-hmm.
So the other crew, basically, they're all kind of working for the same bosses at the site, but there's a difference in their approach. Mm-hmm. The other crew says, no. What you want to do is dig basically a well. Dig a narrow shaft, line it with steel. We'll put steel casing down it. We'll pile drive and weld those steel casing pipes to one another for safety.
So one on top of the other?
One on top of each other, driven into place and then welded. And inside of those are the rescue workers, who are in 24 inches across of steel.
And they can weld in that tiny space?
They can. These are remarkably skilled men who were, by and large, working class guys who dug holes and built things and dug ditches and came out of a number of them, either mining careers previously or World War II construction labor.
So these were not the guys with the PhDs in engineering?
Precisely correct. And so there were some harsh words at the site about, let's do it this way. No, let's do it that way. Everybody's focused on the fate of the little girl. Everybody wants to rescue her. A number of these rescuers had small children at home. I interviewed one, he's since passed, but he was 25 years old. He had 5 children. And he saw this on the TV and came over and eventually ended up under the earth trying to get her.
He was the one who sneaked away from his family, right? Because he didn't
Yes.
want to tell his wife where he was going.
Yes. And by the story that was told is they saw him on TV.
Oh my gosh.
Where's daddy? There's daddy.
Tensions
And
must have been running really high.
tensions do run high. The men are working themselves to exhaustion. It's very hot below the earth. It's dangerous. I asked this man who was 25, whose name was Clyde Harp. I asked Mr. Harp, years and years later, decades later, were you scared? And he said, no, I dug for a living. I wasn't scared when I was digging the narrow rescue shaft, but when I had to tunnel across to get into her well where she was, I was scared, because he's got 90 feet of earth atop that tunnel, whereas the hole is the hole and it's lined with steel. But they're working nonstop. They're working to levels of complete exhaustion. And a number of them come to the surface through either this kind of sling operation here. You see these 2 guys, something like that, or they stood on top of a plastic bucket and were pulled up and down as a kind of bucket elevator. The authorities up top would oftentimes order them to rest, take water. They drink a lot of coffee, take water. The Red Cross is there delivering food, and some of them refused. So there are conflicts and consternation at the site over that kind of thing.
But there was one person who ended up being in charge. Who
Yes.
was that?
There's a kind of default boss, a contractor official executive named Raymond Hill, which is very interesting to those of us in the region because that's the name of the hill where the Raymond Hotel was, the Raymond Hill.
Yeah.
But this is Raymond Hill, the person, who, along with a couple others who were executives in digging operations or sewage tank digging, they consulted with one another. Her father is there throughout the whole thing. Her father is part of the consulting because he understands, he knows that well.
Right.
He knows how deep it
He's in charge
is.
of those wells, right?
He's in charge of them.
And that's
Yep.
another irony.
Yeah. So a couple of these guys basically confederate in rescue urgency and direct the other men. And then, Rira, we have a photograph there above the crater. That man right there. This is the kind of foreman of the operation, a man his name is Homer Blickensderfer, but he goes by Whitey because he had a shock of white hair. And Whitey, his wife, was interviewed at the scene, and she says, that man of mine can do anything. And he was remarkably gifted with his hands and a hard worker. He worked nonstop to try to rescue this little girl, and he was below the hierarchy of leadership, but he's essentially the foreman.
Yeah.
And what happens is the press, because the event is protracted,
Yeah.
the press gets to know these guys, or seems to think it does, and the world gets to know them through their first names, what they stood for, what their wartime service was, how many children they had. So it from anonymity to seeming familiarity across just 48 hours.
So they dig the well, the second well, and then they have to tunnel across. How long, what was the distance that they had to get from tunnel A to tunnel B?
Yeah, the distance between the two shafts is a matter of less than 10 feet. So it's fairly close, but there's water in there, in that shaft, in the rescue tunnel that goes across. At times, the workers are working early on. The workers are working with sometimes electrical tools, and then as they get closer and closer to the water table and to seepage down there, the use of electrical tools is really dangerous because they'll get electrocuted.
Yeah.
So they have to move towards pneumatic tools, which they do. People bring tools to the site. Workers go out to local stores if they're open on Saturday and Sunday and get tools to help them with the work. At a certain moment, the tunnel collapses on one or two rescuers in there who have to be pulled out.
This is the side of this tunnel?
This is the side tunnel, and they're brought up, and they don't lose consciousness, but they're scared to death, and they're revived and put back to work. And then there's some delays. One delay is they have to shore up that rescue tunnel with wood, much like a mining cavern.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always hard to get all the dirt out of there. They're digging a 90+ foot hole next to a more than 90 foot well. And so they've got to get the dirt out of there. And that's not easy to do when you're cramped inside those rescue pipes of steel. All along, they're listening. They're listening for her. There are times when they ask the crowd to be quiet. There are times when they think they hear something. In fact, she had stopped crying within a couple hours of her fall in around dusk or close to dusk on Friday. Mm-hmm. But across Saturday and Sunday, they're trying to hear if she's still alive.
And so how many hours after she fell in were they able to make a contact with that first well?
Well, they're alongside of it for quite some time as they're digging it. And what they also are really trying hard to do is don't build the rescue tunnel too high. Don't enter her well above her. You've got to actually get right below her. You don't want to do it right where she is because you don't want to endanger her if she's alive by cutting a hole in the well. You want to go right to where below her, reach in and grab her. So they've got to measure that. They know what they're doing. And it's about 48 hours when contact is made and her well is opened with essentially a window cut into her well just below where she's pinioned.
Who actually took her?
The man who rises to play this role is a man named Bill Yancey. And Bill Yancey's in one of my photographs here towards the latter part of this. But there are several men down there who go serially down, and the crowd is told to be quiet. And the crowd knows something's up. The Fiscus family had been largely at home, although David Fiskus is at the site quite a bit. Alice is either at home, her parents come up from San Diego County, or she's in the family Studebaker, and it's just kind of a sad vigil. The crowd knows something's up, and then one of the family physicians, there's two in the practice, just a small, general practice physicians, including the man who had delivered her. One of the family physicians is brought to the scene of the second rescue shaft, and he's hooked up into a parachute vest that then is hooked onto a crane, basically, picked up over, we can actually show it, Rira. I'll show you right there, the dark one. Yep, that's it. We can make that bigger probably. So there's the rescue shaft. That's the latest piece of steel to be put on top of it. Then the man in the with the boots that are touching it, who's sort of prone, that's a physician. And the story goes from one of the rescuers, who's actually the guy there holding the tether.
Yeah.
That this physician, his partner, later said he looked like Clark Gable. He looked so handsome and kind of dashing in his rescue work when they hoisted him up like that, which is one way to look at it. The rescuer who insisted that he go down the well, and people are wondering, why is the physician going down the rescue shaft?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So the story from Tommy Francis, one of the diggers, is that the physician was claustrophobic. And at the moment he got lowered into that very tight container, he had a claustrophobic attack and insisted to be brought back out. Where Tommy Francis relayed years later, he said, he was basically having none of that. And he slugged him. He says he hit him and knocked him woozy, whereupon he was lowered down the shaft. And of course,
he actually did go down the shaft.
He did. It sounds like he didn't have a lot of choice.
Not head first, feet first?
No, he's lowered by this device. He's lowered by this device. They're about ready to put him down there. Okay. Or perhaps he's come out. It's either one. It looks to me like they're pulling him up to lower him down. Yep. And you can imagine for a photographer, this is, what a shot. But the reason he's lowered down is the obvious. They've discovered her and she doesn't seem to be alive. And that's in fact true. So they discover her, they cut open her well with a window, and she has died, and he's been brought down there to pronounce that.
I don't understand why they didn't bring her up and spare him and the drama of that moment. Why was it important that he be right there at the moment she was discovered?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that's a really interesting question, Robin. I think what happens about in the aftermath of the discovery that she's died in there is really gripping and fascinating too, which is the television reporters who have pride of place here, because everyone's fascinated by these big bulky TV cameras. And what are those guys doing? They're talking into their microphones, and where's that picture going? Yeah. They announced to the crowd that Kathy's not coming home, that she's died. And they asked the crowd to disperse respectfully so that the family can grieve and the word can be delivered to them.
The crowd knew before the family was told?
I think someone had actually walked to the house and told them, but they say it like this. But I think the family actually had been told by some authority that she'd been discovered dead.
Yeah.
So the crowd does disperse, and the retrieval of her body takes hours. It takes hours. She's down there below. She's dressed in a little. She's put into a little onesie. She was wearing a dress when she was playing, and one of the rescuers basically wraps her in a little onesie and then a blanket. And she's brought to the service. And I think part of the way I'd answer your question is it's very difficult to bring her up.
Yeah.
It's very long and protracted. They're very gentle. And the story is the men down below can be heard over the course of the rescue attempt. They're heard trading all kinds of profanity and "don't drop those tools on my head" again. So they're rough and tumble guys. In the retrieval of the body, they're heard to be very, very gentle. Easy guys, easy, take it easy, let's go slow, be careful. And so it's very touching.
Do they know the cause? We do need to take some questions now, but before we do did they assign a cause of death?
They do. It's again one of the enduring mysteries of this, and part of my own strange obsession with it is I don't think we'll ever. Well, I'm certain actually we'll never know for certain. She was autopsied, and the autopsy record is not discoverable. I've looked high and low. It may be out there, but I don't think so. The initial cause of death at the scene, people say she drowned because she's wet and water comes out of that window. So the implication is that she slipped below where she had been and she dropped into the water table. However, the official cause of death is asphyxiation, that she'd somehow run out of air down there, pinioned in the earth, or pinioned down below the earth, which my rescue interviewees say that's nonsense because she was alive and it's a hole. There's air circulating. It's not much air, but there's air.
And she was talking.
And she was talking and crying. So my assumption is that the physicians wanted to spare the family the agony of knowing that she had been alive and that then she had fallen below the water table and drowned. That the preference was, and one of the physicians said as much years later, to allow the family to assume that she just drifted off, which would have been the case had she asphyxiated. I have my doubts about that as a cause of death. That said, we're not going to know.
Well, I will read some questions if that's okay. Is that all right, Rara?
Yep.
Okay. Well, the first one is, what was the most surprising fact you learned during your research process?
Terrific question. I think there's many of them. So the intricacies of the event and the fact that a lot of it in my mind had gotten wrong because it's complicated to know the sequence when this happened. So I tried to put the puzzle pieces back together. I've located where I think the well is within about 5 feet using friends who know about spatial science and GIS technology. I think in many ways, one of the most surprising findings was that this event changed American naming patterns for little girls in the early years of the baby boom.
Talk about that for a minute.
Well, so her given name is Catherine Ann, but she's known as Kathy. She's known as Kathy for her family and for the media that watches so closely while she's attempted to be rescued. In the aftermath of the event, thousands upon thousands of people, mostly women, wrote to Alice Fiscus and said, either I'm pregnant, or if I become pregnant, and if I have a little girl, I'm going to name her Kathy. And they do. And so the name Kathy skyrockets in popularity like no other name through the early years of the baby boom for girls. Names move with fads, of course. Kathy goes way up, and it goes way up because of this.
That's fascinating. Someone else wants to know, somebody has a question about your agent, which you can answer later, but where did you find some of the amazing photographs you've shared with us?
So I was minding my own business one day at the Huntington Library, and a man contacted me and said, "You're obsessed with Kathy Fiskus." And he was right. And he said, "So was I." And he said, he was a political scientist, academic in Hawaii. And he said, "I'm never going to write the book I want to write about her. I've moved on to other things." He wrote true crime, and very successful. He said, "Would you like to have the photos and interviews I gathered with people over time?" The single most generous scholarly collegiality that's ever happened to me. Amazing. He sent me those things, cassette tapes and photographs. And the other answer to the question is that the very best still photographs of the scene were taken by a 19-year-old stringer for the LA Times, who was a wire service guy named Lee Weiner. Lee Weiner took the best photographs because he didn't do what everybody else did. He went to the house. He took a picture of her empty swing that's on the cover of the book. He went back a year later and took a picture the very same day. His son, Lee Weiner's no longer around. He became a very, very celebrated photographer. His son lovingly and expertly superintends his dad's photo archive and kindly let me use some of his dad's photographs in this book.
Wow. Wonderful. Okay, here's a multi-part question, or several questions in one. Number one, the well casing was 14 inches wide, so how did Kathy fall in? Was it just an unfortunate misstep? 2, she must have been off playing by herself, otherwise the other children would have seen her fall, yes? 3, my understanding is that the neighborhood children knew of the well. Did the Fiskus children know of the well's presence? So you can talk about how she fell in, whether other children saw her, and whether they even knew the well was there.
Great questions again. Questions that haunt me in waking and sleeping hours and have for a decade. I don't know how she got in there. I had my own daughter cut out a circle of 14 inches across and run around it when she was little. I don't think you fall into that unless you're sitting on the edge of it or you jump into it. It's possible. You could have a misstep, I guess, and go feet first down something that small because she's a little child. So it's possible. The discussion I had with the cousins was that they were playing hide and seek. And in that case, it's plausible to assume that she knew that well was there. She just had no idea. She thought it was a hole. Yeah. She had no idea it was as deep as it was at all. So I think the children knew. They certainly, again, it's not the only well out there. There's several. There's a dozen. And some of them are active. One is still inside a pump house near the San Marino High School football field, which is where the well is, underneath the football field. So I think they did know. But she had no apprehension of the danger.
Right. Someone named Debbie asks a really good question, actually. Not that everybody else's weren't great. They were. How did the Fiskus family endure this personal tragedy? Did the media coverage help or hurt them?
So the family moves around the corner and within a couple of years, but still within sight of the field. The house that they moved to is still there on Wallingford. The house they lived in has been taken down. They stayed in San Marino for quite some time. Eventually, they move up the coast to Santa Barbara. They're pillars of the community, much beloved. Everyone knew. They have an unusual last name, so everyone knew. Barbara Fiskus, Kathy's older sister, told me that as she grew and became a teenager and young woman, she would sometimes say she was an only child. And she said if her mother caught wind of that, she would be furious, because of course she wasn't. Alice Fiskus said at every opportunity that she took two redemptive themes away from this tragedy. One is the very day that Kathy went into the well, having undergone surgery recently where she was supposed to not hold her child, her youngest child. That very day, Kathy leapt into her mom's arms, scared by something downtown LA, and Alice held her.
Yeah. She
looked upon that as very meaningful and powerful in the aftermath. And the other thing is more global, the laws that were passed to protect children from wells and other people. Kathy Fiskus laws undoubtedly saved lives. And Mrs. Fiskus, and presumably the entire Fiskus family, took some solace in that and said so.
We have time for one more question, but I'm going to ask two. The first one is from Lisa. What happened to Kathy's siblings? That would be her sister Barbara. What was her life like after the tragedy? You mentioned her mom, but what was Barbara's life? And also, wasn't the mom always called on by the press when somebody would fall down a well or get hurt like that?
Yes, Mrs. Fiskus was sought out when children were in harm's way, particularly below the earth. But essentially, how does this make you feel? And she was always very gracious about that. Barbara Fiskus lives in San Diego County. I've interviewed her a couple of times on the phone. She's absolutely lovely and very generous, and gave me a lot of the photographs that I utilized in my research and in the book. So I don't know much about her life in the intervening 70 plus years, but she couldn't have been more gracious about supporting this project.
That's nice. And finally, you say there were Kathy Fiskus laws, and of course the resonance of the story is that every parent, every person, fears something terrible happening to their child. Falling down a well is the most unimaginable kind of thing. But it seeped into the culture in a way that is almost sometimes hard to know. And you talk about the Lassie story, and I thought maybe we could conclude with that. Why don't you talk about the anecdote you told about Lassie in the book?
Yeah, this is one of your strike zones as a writer and journalist, Robin, is that ways in which American culture continues to surprise us. So the Kathy Fiskus story is embedded in the culture. There's a Simpsons episode where Bart pretends to be down a well and it calls up this. There's the backdrop of radio days. Woody Allen's movie is the Fiskus rescue on the rescue attempt. The Lassie story is that humorous story or anecdote that we all know, where Lassie barks at a human handler who says, "What is it, girl? Has Timmy's down a well? Well, Timmy never goes down a well in the Lassie television show. It doesn't happen. So it's a reverberation of this. Billy Wilder makes Ace in the Hole. Billy Wilder is fascinated by the Fiscus event, as well as an earlier event about a man in a cave in the 1920s. So it certainly enters the culture. I'm blanking on his name. There's a very important abstract expressionist who makes a Kathy Fiskus collage in the early 1960s. So and every time children are put in harm's way, particularly subterranean, like the boys in the Thai cave.
Oh yes.
The Kathy Fiskus event comes up, as it did when Jessica McClure went down the well in Texas.
Exactly. Well, listen, I think I am supposed to wrap things up, although I'm not sure. I'm happy to do so. There you go.
Yes.
Things up. Thank you so much, Bill. This was fabulous. It's such an amazing story. I hope everybody gets a chance to buy the book and read it.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Thank you, Vroman. Thank you, Rira. Thank you, Robin. I really appreciate it. It's always fun to talk to you, Robin.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion, and thank you for sharing such wonderful photographs as well. For those of you who tuned in late, don't worry, you can re-watch the talk in about an hour. It should be under the same stream link. And also, if you would like to purchase a copy of tonight's featured book, just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer's screen. And I think that about does it. Stay safe, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Vromans. Bye-bye.